The top 1% now control 31.7% of all wealth in the United States. That's the highest concentration since the Federal Reserve started tracking this data in 1989. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% of Americans collectively own just 2.5%. Do the per capita math, and the top 1% holds roughly 634 times the wealth of someone in the bottom half. This isn't a prediction. This isn't a trend that might happen. This is happening right now, and the gap is accelerating. When you see why working harder can't close this gap, you'll understand why the entire economic system is built on a mechanism most people never recognize. My name is Alex, and I've spent the last decade analyzing wealth data and Federal Reserve reports so you don't have to. If you want to understand what's really happening with money in America, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it helps you see the system more clearly. Quick question before we dive in. Do you own any stocks or investments outside of retirement accounts, or is your money mostly in cash and checking? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where this audience stands. Here's what you need to understand. The wealth gap isn't widening because rich people work harder or because poor people are lazy. It's widening because wealth and wages operate on completely different mathematics. One compounds exponentially, the other crawls in a straight line. And the system is designed to make sure you never notice the difference until it's too late. The numbers are staggering when you actually look at them. The top 1% owns approximately $55 trillion. That's 31.7% of all wealth in America. The bottom 50%, that's roughly 166 million people, collectively hold about 4.25 trillion. 2.5% of total wealth split among half the country. But here's where it gets worse. Per capita, meaning per person, someone in the top 1% holds about 634 times more wealth than someone in the bottom half. Not 6 times, not 634 times. This data comes from the Federal Reserve's Distributional Financial Accounts, updated January 16, 2026, covering through the third quarter of 2025. These aren't estimates. These are the official numbers, and they're breaking records. Now here's the part that should terrify you. The top 10% of households account for 49.2% of all consumer spending in America. That's according to Moody's Analytics economist Mark Zandi, analyzing Federal Reserve data from the second quarter of 2025. Nearly half of all the money spent in this economy comes from the wealthiest 10%. I need to pause here because this number has been challenged. UC Berkeley economist Antoine Levy argues that Bureau of Labor Statistics data puts the real figure closer to 23%. But Zandi stands by his analysis of the Fed data. Either way, whether it's 49% or 23%, the wealthy are carrying a disproportionate share of economic activity. Zandi estimates that top 10% spending alone accounts for roughly 1/3 of GDP. Let that sink in for a second. 1/3 of the entire American economy depends on wealthy households continuing to spend money. He said in a recent interview, as long as they keep spending, the economy should avoid recession, but if they turn more cautious, the economy has a big problem. Think about what that means. The economy isn't structurally dependent on the middle class spending. It's not even dependent on the working class. It's tethered to whether wealthy people feel confident enough to keep buying. That's the foundation we're all standing on. But here's the thing, nobody's explaining. How did we get here? What happened that created this massive divergence? Because it's not just that rich people have more money. It's that the rate at which they accumulate wealth has completely detached from everyone else. And there's a specific mechanism behind it. The stock market. That's the engine. The S&P 500 hit approximately 2,037 on March 23, 2020, the COVID low. As of February 2026, it's around 6,926. That's a 210% gain from the bottom. Even if you measure from the pre-COVID peak of about 3,386, that's still a 105% gain. The market has more than doubled in less than 5 years. Now, who owns stocks? The typical stockholder in the top 10% owned $1.1 million in equities in the third quarter of 2025, according to University of Michigan survey data. That's up from $624,000 at the end of 2022. A 76% gain in under 3 years. Not from working, not from saving, from holding assets that appreciated. Let me put that in perspective. That's a $476,000 wealth gain just from sitting on stock positions. Now compare that to wages. A worker earning $80,000 a year, which is closer to the current median household income, earned about $240,000 gross over that same 3-year period. Before taxes, before rent, before food, before everything. The stockholder in the top 10% gained nearly twice as much wealth just from asset appreciation as the median worker earned from 3 years of labor. That's the snowball effect. Wealth compounds, wages don't, and it gets worse. The wage growth data shows the divergence clearly. According to Bank of America data from December 2025, higher income households saw 3% wage growth. Middle income households saw 1.5%. Low income workers saw just 1.1%. With inflation running 2.5 to 3%, lower income workers are treading water at best. They're actually losing purchasing power. Middle income workers are barely keeping pace. Only high earners are pulling ahead, and even for them, wage growth is anemic compared to asset appreciation. Middle income households have most of their wealth concentrated in housing. Home prices have been growing, but the pace has been slowing. Lower income Americans are dealing with rising debt loads, credit cards, auto loans, medical bills. The wealthy hold stocks, which keep compounding at rates that wage growth can't touch. This creates what economists call a K-shaped economy. The top part of the K, the wealthy, keeps going up as assets appreciate exponentially. The bottom part of the K, everyone else, either stays flat or declines as wages fail to keep up with inflation and living costs. Two completely different trajectories. Two completely different economic realities. Same country. Think of it as a wealth snowball versus a wage treadmill. If you own assets, you're rolling a snowball down a hill. It picks up more snow as it goes. It gets bigger and heavier. It accelerates. The longer it rolls, the faster it grows. That's compound growth. Your $1 million stock portfolio becomes $1.76 million in 3 years. Then it becomes $3 million. Then $5 million. The growth rate increases as the base gets larger. But if you only have wages, you're on a treadmill. You're moving, but you're not going anywhere. You earn $80,000 this year. Maybe $81,000 next year if you get a 1.5% raise. Then $80,418 the year after. It's linear. It's slow. And it's getting harder because the cost of everything is rising faster than your paycheck. What I'm about to show you next is the thing that took me years to understand, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The system rewards asset ownership, not labor. It's built that way. It's not a bug, it's a feature. And here's why working harder doesn't close the gap. Let's do the math explicitly so you can see the mechanics. You work 40 hours a week. Let's say you make $80,000 a year. That's about $38.46 per hour. You get a 3% raise. That's the high end for wage growth right now. Your income goes to $82,400. You gain $2,400 in a year through labor. Meanwhile, someone with a $1.1 million stock portfolio sees a 10% return, a fairly normal year in this market. That's $110,000. They didn't work for it. They didn't trade time for it. They owned assets, and the assets appreciated. That $110,000 gain in 1 year is more than your entire gross salary. And remember, the typical top 10% stockholder gained $476,000 over 3 years just from equities. You earned $240,000 gross over that same period from labor. They made nearly twice as much by doing nothing except owning. That's the structural problem. You can't out-earn exponential growth with linear income. It's mathematically impossible. You're bringing addition to an exponentiation fight. Now here's where it gets truly dangerous. The economy is structurally dependent on the wealthy continuing to spend. Zandy's analysis shows that if the top 10% pull back on spending for any reason, a stock market correction, recession fears, geopolitical instability, the entire economy is in trouble. Consumer spending drives about 70% of GDP. If half of that spending comes from 10% of households, those households have veto power over economic growth. Think about what that means during a downturn. Stocks drop. The wealthy see their portfolios shrink. They get nervous. They cut spending. Consumer demand falls. Companies see revenue decline. They lay off workers. Those workers, the bottom 90%, lose income and cut their spending even more. The spiral accelerates. And because the wealthy control such a large share of spending, their pullback has outsized consequences. We're halfway through, and if you're still with me, you're already seeing the system more clearly than most people ever will. But don't stop now, because what comes next is how you actually navigate this reality. The question isn't whether this is fair. The question is what you do about it. Because here's the thing, you can't change the system, but you can't change which side of it you're on. You can't force wages to compound, but you can force yourself to own assets that do. Let me be very clear about what I'm saying. I'm not telling you to quit your job and become a day trader. I'm not saying wages don't matter. What I'm saying is that if your only source of wealth accumulation is your paycheck, you are on the wrong side of the math. You are on the treadmill while the snowball is rolling past you. The most important gap to close isn't the gap between you and the 1%. That's not realistic for most people. The most important gap to close is the gap between zero assets and some assets. Between owning nothing that compounds and owning something that compounds. Even small amounts start the snowball effect. Here's why. Let's say you manage to invest $5,000. The market returns 10% in a year. That's $500. It's not life-changing money. But you didn't trade time for it. You owned an asset and it grew. The next year, you invest another $5,000. Now you have $10,500. It grows 10% again. That's $1,050. You're starting to see the compounding. Year 3, you add another $5,000. You have $16,050. It grows to $18,250. You've now gained $3,250 from appreciation alone, separate from what you contributed. Is that going to make you rich overnight? No. But you're now on the right side of the mechanism. You're building a snowball, and the earlier you start, the more time compound growth has to work. The typical top 10% stockholder didn't start with $1.1 million. They started with something. They stayed consistent. They let time and compounding do the work. And the gap between them and everyone else widened not because they worked exponentially harder, but because they owned assets that grew exponentially. Now I know what you're thinking. Alex, I don't have $5,000 lying around. I can barely cover rent. And I hear you. That's real. But here's the brutal truth you need to hear. If you're spending $15 a day on convenience, fast food, coffee, impulse purchases, that's $5,475 a year. I'm not saying cut everything, I'm saying be intentional. Because every dollar you spend on consumption is a dollar that could have been compounding. And the opportunity cost is staggering over time. Let me give you the math. $5,000 invested once and left alone for 30 years at 10% average annual return becomes about $87,247. That's the power of compounding. That's the snowball effect. But if you spend that $5,000 on stuff you don't need, it's gone. It gave you temporary satisfaction and left you with nothing. This is why the wealthy stay wealthy. They understand opportunity cost. They understand that money can either be consumed or deployed. Consumption feels good in the moment. Deployment feels like nothing, but deployment compounds. Consumption disappears. The real magic isn't in the stock picks or the timing or the secret strategies. The real magic is in shifting from a wage-only mindset to a wage-plus assets mindset. Most people never make that shift. They spend everything they earn. They justify it by saying they deserve it after working hard. And they do deserve comfort, but they're trading long-term compounding for short-term comfort, and that trade has consequences. Let me show you what those consequences look like in real time. The bottom 50% collectively owns 2.5% of all wealth. That's 166 million people sharing $4.25 trillion. The average person in the bottom half has about $25,600 in total net worth. The average person in the top 1% has about $16.2 million. That's the 624-to-1 ratio I mentioned at the start. How did that gap get so wide? It's not because people in the top 1% work 624 times harder. It's because they've been on the right side of the compounding mechanism for longer. Their assets have been snowballing for decades while everyone else stayed on the wage treadmill. And here's the part that should make you angry. The system is designed to keep you on the treadmill. Marketing and consumer culture are engineered to make you spend every dollar you earn. You're bombarded with messages telling you that you deserve the new phone, the new car, the vacation, the upgrade. And you do deserve those things. But the system profits when you consume instead of accumulate. It profits when you stay on the treadmill. Credit cards are designed to keep you in debt. The minimum payment structure ensures you pay interest for years. Auto loans stretch to 84 months so you can afford the monthly payment but end up underwater on the car. Student loans are structured so that even high earners spend decades paying them off. Every part of the system is designed to extract money from you and prevent you from accumulating assets. The wealthy know this. They avoid consumer debt. They use leverage strategically to acquire assets, not liabilities. They understand the difference between good debt and bad debt. Good debt is debt that buys something that appreciates or generates income. Bad debt is debt that buys something that depreciates or generates nothing. Now let me tie all of this together, because when you see how these pieces connect, everything changes. The top 1% owns 31.7% of all wealth because they own assets that compound. The bottom 50% owns 2.5% because they rely on wages that don't. The stock market has more than doubled since the COVID low. The typical top 10% stockholder gained $476,000 in 3 years just from holding equities. The median worker earned $240,000 gross over that same period from labor. Wage growth is 1 to 3%. Asset appreciation is 10% or more in a good year. The math doesn't work. You can't catch up on wages alone. The economy is structurally dependent on the top 10% continuing to spend. If they pull back, the whole system is at risk. That's how concentrated wealth has become. That's how fragile the foundation is. But here's what that means for you. Without assets, you're falling behind even if you get raises. Inflation erodes purchasing power. Living costs rise faster than wages. The gap widens. You're working harder and getting nowhere. The only way to break out of that cycle is to shift from wage-only to wage-plus assets. Even small asset positions start the compounding process. The gap between zero and something is the most important gap to close, because once you have something, it can grow. Zero can't grow. Zero stays zero. This isn't about becoming a millionaire overnight. This isn't about timing the market perfectly or finding the next big stock. This is about understanding the mechanism. Wealth compounds. Wages don't. If you want to build wealth, you need to own things that compound. The system isn't going to change. The top 1% isn't going to stop accumulating. The stock market isn't going to stop rewarding asset owners. The only thing you can control is which side of the equation you're on. And that decision starts right now. What financial topic is affecting your life that you can't find a straight answer on? Let me know in the comments. That's what this channel is for. 10 years from now, you'll look back at this moment and realize it was the turning point. The moment you stopped being a passive victim of the system and became an active participant in your own wealth building. The person you're becoming starts with what you do next. Your future self is counting on you to see the math clearly and act on it. Don't let them down.